Test. Are you ready? Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Chrissy Marie, and I'm the founder and creator behind the prismaticlife.com and the Prismatic Academy podcast. It's a space for the telling of true stories, creating connection, and supporting the expression of conscious co-creation. We encourage courage and open up conversations to inspire and empower you to embrace your authentic creative... What? Okay. So terrible. One more take? Okay, let's do it. Hi guys, welcome to episode 1 of the Prismatic Academy podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I am so excited to have this platform and share with you my first podcast ever. Yay! So, since I'm completely new to this, I wasn't really sure where to start. My gut said to share a story. After all, as a storyteller, that's what I do. But that immediately led to the question of which story do I share? Where do I begin? Well, thanks, universe, because shortly after tossing some ideas around, I was reminded of a quote by Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice Through the Looking Glass. Paraphrased, it says, to begin at the beginning. It sounds simple, right? Well, honestly, sharing the beginning of my story wasn't the direction I was hoping to go for this first episode. For those of you who I'm just now having the pleasure of connecting with, I run a website called theprismaticlife.com, and it's where I keep and express bits and pieces of my journey around healing, lifestyle design, and creative entrepreneurship. Sharing my stories isn't really a new thing for me, but since we're so newly acquainted, I really wanted to start this podcast off with something light and inspiring, which is the exact opposite of the beginning of my story. In fact, the beginning as a creative entrepreneur and storyteller for me was a messy and weird and scary and awful one. I sprouted from one of the darkest periods of my life, a place known as the soul crisis. At first, I kind of dismissed the idea altogether. I mean, was I really about to introduce myself and the show as, "Hi, I'm Chrissy, and I'm going to talk to you about everything awful about being a creative, conscious entrepreneur"? No, thank you. Imagining myself in that space and sharing the story of my soul crisis, it just seemed like a really bad idea. But it was one that I couldn't seem to easily bypass. Over the past couple of weeks in getting started with this podcast, the experiences of the soul crisis were constantly being brought into my awareness from every direction. And I finally only fully committed to this direction and sharing the story of some of my darkest experiences after having lunch with a good friend. Now, out of respect for their privacy, I'm not going to say who this friend is, but everything kind of hit me when what started out as a casual lunch, halfway through our catching up, I saw tears begin to swell in their eyes. My heart was breaking for them as I started to recognize what was really happening. I've never seen this friend cry before, let alone show emotions of sadness or hurt. It was really apparent that they were at the beginning of their soul crisis. Their life and what they loved was all on the verge of a tipping point where everything as they knew it won't ever be the same. And I think they knew that too. They were feeling lost and confused and unsafe about uncertain outcomes they didn't seem able to control. And their energy felt desperate for help and guidance and to feel understood and accepted, even though they felt completely broken and awful. Seeing my friend in pain reminded me of my own similar experiences. It was then that I realized how important it is to share this story. After all, I've been there too. I remembered how there really was so much grief and confusion, heartache and fear, and like my friend at the time, I didn't really know what to do with any of it. I was trapped in a soul crisis, that I couldn't see a way out of, and honestly, I didn't think that there was one. But in emerging from my soul crisis, I knew exactly what they were feeling and what can be expected in this place of transformation. And I just wanted them to know that I did understand, that they are accepted, that they aren't alone through this, and that on the other side is a bigger, better, happier version of themselves beyond anything that they can even imagine right now, even though that place feels like it's the farthest place possible. It's not always easy to share raw and authentic stories, and especially ones like these about the soul crisis. It's easy for us to want to bypass it. It's an icky part of the journey to a more authentic version of ourselves, and we tend to want to just get on with things and focus on the good parts. I know that in my own story, I still feel some pain come up around remembering my soul crisis. I want to look away and leave it behind me, but I know that if I did that, I would not only be doing a great disservice to myself and my own story, but also a disservice to everyone either going through or having been through a soul crisis, who maybe just really need to feel understood and hear a little bit of encouragement to help them through and move past this period, because in the grand scheme of things, a soul crisis, though incredibly uncomfortable, is really the starting point of an incredible journey for thousands of conscious creators and visionaries. It's the beginning of the process of awakening, but in order to get to that higher state of being, we are confronted with everything we need to let go of, everything that holds us back from being a greater, more authentic version of ourselves. I never once thought that I would be on this path, especially not in this way. I was completely unprepared for the whirlwind of chaos that overtook my life. Only 2 years ago, I had already created a life that I thought I really wanted. It was everything that I thought I should want. I really thought that I just made it and was winning at life. I was married to a man I love so much. We had a beautiful ocean view home in a community that was so perfect. We were excited about our businesses and just started a new one that seemed so fun and creative and completely different from what we were already doing. And we were even talking about starting a family at the time. I was proud of myself. I was proud of us. And I was completely over the moon with how things were going, because that's how they should have been, right? Boy, did all of that change faster than I could even keep up with. Literally as if overnight, in some crazy form of accelerated, destructive chaos, it all came crashing down. Where one day I was living a dream, the next I found myself on the wrong end of a heartbreaking divorce that ultimately left me nearly broke and homeless, completely depressed, chronically fatigued for the second time in my life, and honestly, so afraid. I hope the story I will share with you will inspire you to not give up and to learn to simply trust yourself. If you're experiencing a soul crisis, it's because life is wanting something more from you, and you, whether you're aware of it or not, are also wanting something more from life. You're ready to be bigger, more visible, more expansive, more of everything than you've ever known yourself to be. So to begin at the beginning, here's episode 1, chapter 1 in the journey of a creative. Chapter 1, the soul crisis. Broken. My whole world was broken. I remember sitting there on the floor of my kitchen, staring blankly at the shattered shards of everything I loved. My dreams all in broken pieces, no longer with a form recognizable to my heart. No amount of tears would glue those shards back together. I know. I spent them all on that floor. I couldn't breathe. I was sucked into the vacuum, that spiraling void where air escapes you. In the space of nothingness, it's impossible to look forward. You're deprived of your senses. You're deprived of direction. You're deprived of everything you've ever known. The world becomes different. You want to panic about all of the unknown, but the void holds you in this moment where eternity is stretched beyond eternity. In this space, I felt nothing. I was empty. I let myself be lost in depression. It was a depression so deep that the pain of my loss couldn't even be felt or grieved. I thanked God for that. I was in a completely mindless state. You know, the kind of state when you stare passively at walls and fidget with whatever's on your person. I sat there rolling my wedding ring off and on my finger. I stayed here for quite some time. Honestly, I don't even know how long. It was nice to not feel anything for once. After everything I've just been through, I needed the break. I was exhausted. Exhausted from the shock, from the crying, from all of my worrying about what was to come next for me, and how I just knew it was going to be completely different from anything I'd ever known before. In truth, I wasn't ready. I could feel a major shift being imposed upon my being, but in that moment, I just wanted to deny it, to resist it, to hold it off for as long as I could. I wanted to stay comfortable, complacent. I wanted to stay safe. I didn't want to get divorced. I didn't want to be alone, and I didn't want to lose my home. I didn't want to start over. I worked so hard. I didn't want things to be different, and I didn't want to deal with how the world would judge me in having lost everything. My husband was leaving me. I fought so hard to not let go. I fought tooth and nail. I fought with my misery and was willing to sacrifice all happiness, every part of me. But in the end, none of it mattered. I had no choice but to move on. For the past 8 years of my relationship, since just before I was 20, my world was our world. In my concept of love and marriage at the time, there was no space allowed in it solely just for me. I thought it was selfish to want something of my own in our marriage, so I denied myself the thought. And now I was about to be faced with having nothing. Nothing but myself. I didn't know what to do with that. I wanted to say that I believed so strongly in our love, that it was unique and special. And even though there was a deep love, in reality, what was holding everything together, the reason why I tried so hard and fought so hard for my marriage and for sameness, the reason why I gave every last ounce of my being was because I needed him. I needed him because I didn't know how to be without him. I depended on him to give me my sense of self-worth, and I also depended on him financially. I was paralyzed with fear with all that I was about to lose. I was so frustrated because I knew I could do what it took to hold us together, despite our different cultures and values. I could maintain the sameness, the comfortable and familiar content. I knew I had enough love, and I knew I had a capable mind and heart big enough to get us through rough patches that to me only seemed temporary. I wanted to believe so strongly in love that I would willingly blind myself to the truth of having fears of being alone, and I would fight desperately to keep and maintain something that wasn't working for either of us, no matter what it took or the happiness it cost us both. But he pulled the trigger. He wasn't blind like I was. He could feel what I couldn't. He couldn't tolerate what I could. Ultimately, I had to realize that with my entire life and beliefs, I had built a castle of sand, and through my glorious efforts grounded in fear, unhappiness, and attachment, I created a maelstrom with a tide that would swiftly destroy it all. I created a soul crisis. When the day came when I was told that our marriage was definitively over, that there was no turning back, when I was completely cut off from our life, I did nothing. I was still in denial, holding on to my fears. It was the same in the months that followed. I was still resistant to the transition, pretending it away and unwilling to face it. I decided not to decide. I chose to be wounded and feel rejected by our separation. I felt so worthless and thrown away. I felt defeated and angry because it seemed that the only thing that this divorce was creating was more and more struggle after years of struggle. All I could see was my loss, my emptiness, and a sense of hopelessness. I was so pissed off that he was doing this to me, to us. After years of giving so much, I just wanted my love to mean something more to him. I wanted my sacrifices to not have been made in vain. I wanted to not be tossed aside like a play toy one outgrows. And more than anything, I really didn't want it to all be for nothing. So I continued to resist. Instead of moving forward, I fought for my desire to have something more meaningful that wasn't grounded in anything meaningful, to be validated by the invalid in all of the wrong ways. To say that I was uncooperative during this period wouldn't even scratch the surface. I want to say that I was driven to fight by a last hope for us, but the truth was that at this point, I really just didn't know how to move forward. I couldn't see it happening. I thought the world was over, that I was just a complete failure, that it really all was for nothing, and this kept me stuck in a paralyzing state of fear. I feared for my safety and well-being. I feared letting go of things that I loved. I was so blinded and exhausted by that fear that I couldn't even see the next right step I should take, so I simply didn't. In my lack of indecision, I deferred my power to my ignorance. I deferred it to a circumstance that allowed me to be a victim, and before I knew it, divorce was not something I was a part of, but rather something that was happening to me. The storm raged on and I was sinking. No, I was drowning, and in my denial and inability to let go, I was letting myself drown. There's a cliche saying that goes, hope for the best but prepare for the worst, and I instead simply chose to do neither. Void of my power, and in deciding not to decide, I was forfeiting every resource I had to survive this crisis, and making matters worse with every passing day. Now I can only imagine how much frustration this caused my soon-to-be ex-husband. I can't speak for him, but at the time, I really didn't care. I was focused on feeling sorry for myself. I knew I was forcing his hand. If he really wanted to move on and forward with his life, if his desire was so strong to leave me behind, he was going to have to be the only player in the game, not only because I physically and emotionally couldn't, but I would have refused even if I could. And even though I won't condone the actions that he took, I can say from a now more expanded perspective that I left him with very few options. I didn't believe that he ever wanted to hurt me, but that was not an option that I made available to either of us at the time. I was going to be hurt. I was going to make him hurt me. And it did hurt. It hurt badly. Losing my marriage was only the beginning. Bank accounts were closed. I was no longer welcome in our business. Our home was no longer our home, and it wasn't going to go to me. Legal action was brought against me several times, and I felt more financially threatened than ever. With all of our assets being put in his name, our marriage was built on promises that were all being broken. And at one point during this period, I had to beg my family, even my little sister, for money in order to keep a roof over my head. I was so embarrassed, not only in having to ask for help, but in having to admit how naive I had been in the structure of our assets. I was ashamed. I felt like I was letting everyone down, and I felt so much guilt around having created a situation that not only left myself vulnerable, but also left my family vulnerable to the destruction taking place. To say that it was a tragic and hard summer full of tears would be grotesquely dishonorable to the pain my spirit and heart were experiencing. In my guilt and shame, embarrassment and failure, I fell into an even deeper depression. I was at the bottom of the bottom, and all I cared about was escaping my situation. I relied heavily on smoking and drinking, and I practiced extreme isolation, not giving anyone the opportunity to judge me. I was hurting myself, and I felt like all I could do in that moment was hurt others, so I hid away from the world and took solace in my vices. I didn't let anything out, and I definitely didn't let anything or anybody in. Friends, family, everyone. I was so ashamed. I imagined myself on the other side of this divorce, sick, broke, jobless, and homeless. I felt like a complete failure, unworthy, unlovable, and without any real merit of accomplishment. Where I was once considered a person who had built a life most people dream of having, I now had nothing to offer and nothing to show for it. I was weak, and I was broken, and I wasn't doing anything about it. I couldn't face the world, not like this, so I slept. A lot. I slept for days, weeks, months. I became sick more often than I've ever been. Most days I didn't even leave my bed, not even to feed myself, and when I did, it was to drink myself back to sleep. I was letting myself fade away and refused to communicate with everyone I knew. When I did manage to get outside of the house, it was always late at night to party with strangers. I took drugs, I slept with guys only to disappear before the night ended and never see them again. It seemed to take a special kind of self-hatred to do all of this to myself and to others. But I no longer had any motivation or reason to do anything other than feel sorry for myself. I hated myself so much that when I wasn't busy crying, I did the only other thing that I could do, which was to shut off, shut down, and escape. Rest was my biggest indulgence. I needed a break from my self-hatred, from my shame, from my fears, from my bad patterns and behaviors and self-defeating thoughts. I needed a break from needing to be anything to myself or anyone. I needed a break from believing that a better life was possible, because deep down, I cynically feared the possibility that what if I was really wrong about everything? What if there really was only suffering and destruction in this reality? What if we only really pretend to be happy? What if we really do build ourselves up only to be broken down, and that's why we harden our hearts and create a tough exterior in order to resist the possibility of having anything better than what's in front of us, than what we're dealt? What if I really was an idealistic, Disney-fied, naive little girl full of fantasy, full of crap? I didn't want to think about it. I can't say that I didn't every so often have days where I felt somewhat okay, like I could try to make something more of my life and myself. There would sometimes be a small ounce of courage that told me that I could do this, that I could get a job, or at least look for one, and that I could turn my situation around. But ultimately, the fears and hopelessness would creep back in, and I would end up getting frustrated and succumb back to sleep. It was like I was dependent on it, and it soon became something that I felt I couldn't escape. I would wake up fatigued and in a daze. I felt trapped inside a 500-pound soggy limp noodle. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't use my mind. I couldn't trust myself in this state. And in slugging my tired body around, I would eventually either break down in tears again or be so exhausted, even by the most minimal effort, that I would again need to sleep. I hated feeling fatigued. I was so tired of being tired. I wanted so badly just to push through this and get it over with and move on. People do that, right? So why couldn't I? Why was I feeling trapped inside a body and energy that just wouldn't let me do what I thought I had to do, if only to simply survive? Pinned to a bed, swimming in mind fog and fatigue, and feeling completely incapable of setting life back on track. It's almost as if the rest of the world escapes you. Perspective becomes so myopic and intensely focused on all that is wrong with you. The ego rolls out the red carpet for judgment and shame and drains your soul of the very essence of hope that sustains it. What was becoming of me? How much further will I travel away from who I knew I was? What happened to the dreamer and the believer in the best of all things? What happened to that stubborn fighter who, when challenged, would push harder to always give more? Sure, I had my hang-ups before. I was quiet, shy, and reserved. But at the very least, I felt accomplished. I had a good heart that loved to dream. I deeply cared about others, and I was hopeful and excited about life and what was possible. I liked who I was. I was proud of who I was. But now, I couldn't even recognize myself. I looked and felt like crap. There did come a day, some 6 months later, where, from half panic, half hatred, I drew the energy to leave my bed and decided to force myself to fix everything that was so intolerable about my life and myself. I mean, it was a practical effort because I wasn't sure how much longer I would last in sleeping my days away. I knew the time was coming when I would run out of my savings and be kicked out of my house, and I felt a very real and fearful need to be ready for that. In this place, it didn't seem like following my heart would get me anywhere. In fact, that was the furthest thing from my mind. I couldn't imagine myself ever being happy again, ever not being hopeless. So instead, I decided to suck it up and went to extremes when it came to getting my life back, in the only ways I knew how. To be honest, not only was I in a place of anger and fear, I was also in a place of revenge. I told myself that I was going to be so hot and beautiful that my ex would be sorry that he left me. So I threw myself into hard workouts and detoxed heavily. I also told myself that I was going to be so financially successful that I would show him how I didn't need any of his money or support ever again. So I desperately searched for jobs without regard or discretion about what would make me happy. I did everything I thought I could do to show my ex-husband and everyone that I didn't need them and that I am so much bigger without them. Can you guess how far that got me? Sure you can. I wasn't setting myself up for positive change. I was setting myself up to repeat my old patterns and behaviors, leading me straight back to a place of feeling like a failure and disappointment. At the time, I didn't care. I thought that anything was better than who I was and where I was. I took the first job offered to me, and it made me miserable. I ended up getting fired from it only 3 months later. I made my body so weak and susceptible to illness that I even landed myself in the emergency room twice. And in not having insurance at the time, I was stuck with 2 huge hospital bills I could barely pay. I restricted my eating. I dated people who made me feel small, and I would hang out with people who I allowed to manipulate me and make me feel horrible about myself. Again, I was running in circles, searching for a way out of my situation in all of the wrong places, wasting my time and again becoming sick and exhausted and no closer to the end of the soul crisis. What was I doing? Was I trying to show myself that I couldn't escape this? Was I trying to prove myself right? That I couldn't really succeed? That I couldn't support a life of my own, let alone a happy one? That I couldn't be or have anything more than this sad, wasted life? By this time, almost 9 months had passed since the beginning of my soul crisis, and here I was, still so judgmental and hard on myself. Again without direction, again without purpose. I cried for days. I wanted so badly just to figure it all out, to get unstuck. I was smart, I was skilled, I could do so many things. There wasn't a reason as to why I was hitting every single dead end when it came to getting out of this awful state. I couldn't understand why I couldn't get anywhere beyond my circumstance, and all I desperately wanted was to be anywhere but here. I just wanted to be able to appreciate myself. I wanted to be able to look in the mirror and like what I saw. I desperately wanted to say that I made it, that I was aware enough, spiritual enough, sensible enough to get myself out of this place. But my story didn't really look like that. I wasn't one of the ones who could say that in their soul crisis they faced their fears head on. I was still holding on so tightly to mine, letting them drive me and consume me. I was wounded and clung to that pain because it made me feel a sense of me being right in the situation and my ex being wrong. And it was that feeling of wanting to feel validated for being wronged that trumped my desire for wanting to be happy, for wanting to move on, and for wanting to be a better version of myself. So I stayed in this place of crisis until one day I no longer couldn't. And trust me, it wasn't because I had much of a say in it. Remember the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland? He tends to be a great guide in a very twisted way. He said, if you don't know where you're going, any road you take will get you there. So really, without discretion of direction, and in wanting to simply be anywhere but where you're at, it will ultimately lead you to nowhere at all. And that's exactly where I was. Nowhere going to nowhere. Stuck in the stuckness. Not knowing what else to do after doing everything I knew to do. None of it worked anyway, and while more or less in a state of total and complete defeat, I surrendered to that space of nothing. I couldn't manipulate myself out of the crisis, so I simply stopped trying. I stopped looking for jobs. I didn't care where the money was going to come from. I stopped forcing myself to work out. I didn't care if I was no longer slender and skinny or could fit into any of my cute clothes. I stopped pretending that everything was fine, and I stopped being disappointed with the universe for not giving me what I thought I wanted in the way I wanted. After a few days of simple nothing, I eventually stopped feeling punished. And while I still slightly panicked about how I was going to survive this, the biggest transformation came when I stopped placing my judgments on the situation and let go of my expectations of how I thought everything was supposed to be. When I stopped resisting exactly where I was at, I began to see a path unfolding. It was unfamiliar, one of quiet observation, and one I knew nothing about, but all I had left was to look at it. You see, it took me a long time to understand this. I guess it goes in line with the concept of what you resist persists. But ultimately, what I learned in this place of nothing, in the dark night of the soul, was that when we manage to simply sit still and listen, when we can just be where we're at without judgment, no matter how uncomfortable or strong the desire is to panic or force your way out, we create the conditions necessary for a cleansing to begin. It's a step towards pure consciousness. the truth among all of the untruths we've been living by. We create the space for our attention and energy to begin to shift away from getting rid of our discomforts and pains, and instead divert it in the direction of our true transformation. We are directed towards awakening. You see, what I came to realize was that through my crisis, I was still trying to do everything that was out of alignment with what I was truly wanting. And I'm talking on the soul level, the level of your core desires and reasons for being. For me, what I was really wanting was freedom. In reality, I did create freedom in my soul crisis. I just wasn't conscious or deliberate about how I wanted it to look. Before my place of stillness, I was acting from a place of fear and desperation, and I was making the mistake of trying to get my old life back, resisting any new possibilities for a greater life experience. You cannot evolve into greater opportunity by always being what you once were, and I had to realize that I was never going to be what I once was. It was something I had to accept, that my ego had to accept in order to have and experience freedom. Our beings crave evolution. We have to face forward for energy to flow, but first we have to sit still and discover which way forward is. We get to choose, and we get the opportunity to be deliberate about it. And it was only when I allowed for space to be created where I could look at my situation as a whole with honest eyes and an open heart when I started to see my soul crisis as an opportunity rather than a punishment. It was only then that things started to shift and possibility began to reveal its magic. And it was magical. Emerging from my soul crisis meant that for the first time I got to ask myself what really makes me happy. What am I really wanting out of life, and what is life wanting from me? It showed me that I was allowed to remove myself from all of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, even the cans and can'ts that I was previously living my life from. It released me from my judgments of how I thought my life was supposed to be, and opened me up to the possibility of what it could be. And although it didn't happen overnight, and definitely didn't happen without the love and support of people I let in after releasing myself from old patterns and behaviors that were no longer serving me, I saw myself beginning to feel shiny and new. My worries were melting away, and I began to feel free to pursue and finally be supported by the things that my heart was truly longing for. Here I'm reminded of a story I was told years before by a yoga instructor. It was one about how the caterpillar evolves into a butterfly. Have you ever wondered what it's like for this gentle little bug as it goes through its transformation? What must it be experiencing? If you cut open a chrysalis, you will find something that resembles neither a caterpillar nor a butterfly. There's only this gray-looking mush and a tiny red beating heart at the center, only visible by the use of a microscope. It's incredible to think that from this state of gray mush, this little bug goes from an almost blind caterpillar and transforms into a butterfly with over 20,000 eyes that can see for miles. In a seemingly reduced form, did it think that this was the end? Or did it trust the process, knowing that if it just goes through it, it will transform into something more incredible and free to roam the earth? Did it know that it would have the ability to travel thousands of miles and have more access to abundance and greater variety of experiences? I know that the soul crisis can be terrifying. It can be a place where extreme hardship can completely rock our world. It can create cracks in our foundation and leave us feeling shaken up and unsure about everything. Where one day you're feeling awesome and content in your world as a caterpillar, the next you become some kind of gray mush trapped inside a shell you can't seem to break out of. But really, the soul crisis is a truly unique experience. It's a training ground for the soul, or rather an untraining ground. It's a place where we shed our former selves' beliefs and patterns. an in-between of the death of our previous life and the birth of our new one, that demands that we let go of everything that no longer serves or supports our spirit and purpose. It's a profound test of faith, endurance, inner purification, and surrender. And even more so, it's a necessary part of our reality that leads us closer to our higher self and our natural state of divine brilliance. I hold this as a truth. I went from a place of being desperately afraid every single day, of crying every single day, of waking up with panic attacks, to a place of bliss, freedom, and finding my purpose. In going through the soul crisis, I want you to know that you get to be exactly where you're at. And when you're ready, you get to choose whether you want to stay here or move forward into happiness. It's okay if it takes time. It's okay if it takes tears. It's okay if it takes anger and rage. But ultimately, in the darkest depths of despair and hopelessness, you have an opportunity to step into a place of total and complete fulfillment. It's what you've been asking for, and it's yours for the taking. Thank you guys so much for allowing me to share my story with you. I know it was a bit of a heavy share, so thanks for sticking through it with me, and I hope that it inspired you to keep moving forward with your evolution and to keep exploring stepping into your creative potential. If there's anything that I'm really sure of, it's that no matter where you are in your journey, within you lies very unique and powerful gifts that need to be expressed in this world. Thank you also to everyone who supported me and encouraged me to put this podcast together. It feels so privileged to be surrounded by so many incredible people in my life. You all are so amazing, so thank you, thank you, thank you. If you enjoyed this podcast or felt that it resonated with you or believe that others would gain some value and insight from it, please, please, please leave a review. I'm not sure if some of you know, but leaving a review and helping with higher ratings will ultimately help this podcast become more visible to those who are searching for something like this. And I would love to have this platform be one that can continue to serve, inspire, and support others in their journey, as well as invite them along on ours together. Also, I'll be sure to include in the show notes some of the resources, exercises, and meditations I use to overcome those health and life challenges and depression I discussed in this episode. There are some really great books that I latched onto, as well as a few healers who lovingly provided me with their invaluable guidance. I'm not sure how I would have gotten through it without them. Coming up in episode 2, I'll be having the pleasure of sharing my interview with an awesome entrepreneur and creative visionary, Matt Ritchie. We'll be chatting about something that may seem slightly controversial to a lot of people, and that is the topic of using cannabis to access higher states of consciousness. It was a really fun chat, and I definitely learned a lot. Matt is such a pleasure to speak with, so I can't wait for you guys to hear our conversation. Last, to close out, I heard this piece of advice today from a friend and thought it was super appropriate to use to button up this first podcast. She said, "Stop trying so hard, love. Things always work out for you, remember? Your highest destiny is going to unfold whether you believe it or not. Trust and believe that the highest and best is on its way to you, and that it will be bigger and better than you've ever imagined. Things are happening for you, not to you. Relax and stay unattached to the outcome of things so your mind can stay clear, your heart can stay light, and your body can stay calm." So beautiful, right? To keep up during the in-betweens, you can check out and follow me at The Prismatic Life and The Prismatic Academy on Facebook, as well as on theprismaticlife.com, where you can also find the show notes and info about past and future episodes. So, until next time, cheers everyone!